Tēnā koutou katoa. So, as I said, I'm going to be talking about Phytophthora and climate. So, figure out this thing. No, wrong way. So, Phytophthora, I'm going to start off. What does it mean? It is plant destroyer. And I'm going to say when pathologists who deal with things that kill trees call a genus a plant destroyer, you really need to be listening up. There's a very good reason why this particular group of organisms are called Phytophthora. So to date we know there's about 100 species that have been described, but there's probably about 500 that sit in there. It's a notorious group for killing plants or causing severe disease on them. They're not fungal organisms, they're actually from the oomycete, and just so you can sort of see, I know it isn't a pointer, it's actually more closely related to plants than what they are to fungi. They do look like they're fungal organisms, but they're not, they're water moulds. Quite interestingly, aerial and soil-borne. So in New Zealand, we didn't have until quite recently, or we didn't know that we had aerial ones, but recently there's actually been more of an increase in aerial Phytophoras, not just the waterborne ones that most people will be familiar with. We have about 30 species of Phytophthora here in New Zealand, and I'm not going to go through, despite my love of Phytophthora and things like that, I'm not going to go through what they all are. But what do they like? So they love wet or over-irrigated soils. They have zoospores, which are motile, which can swim through the water. They love it when the soil oxygen levels drop, and that's because of those over-wet soils. They love temperate conditions, so it's around about 15 degrees to 30 degrees that they tend to like the most, and it differs for each pathogen. So you'll have some which maybe flourish at 15 degrees Celsius and others that flourish at 30, but within reason sort of over that range. They also love it when there's been an environmental stressor that causes the plant to be stressed, and that can also be nutrient deficiency. So I was asked to talk about what are the effects of climate change. So I'm going to go back to those slides in a minute, but I'm going to just talk about climate change. And so this is from the UN. So what are the effects? And I know that we all probably know what these are, but I'm just going to make sure we're all on the same page. Hotter temperatures. So increasing the global temperatures, and you can see for New Zealand, I'm not going to go through that either, but we are going to have an increase in temperatures here, and we're already feeling those effects. More severe storms, we've also felt the effects of those recently. And then you're going to be getting that greater rainfall, more flooding, just like we've seen over this last summer. That wasn't really a summer. Then there's also increased drought, and we've also seen that from previous years, and everything should be exasperating under the changing climate. So what does this mean for Phytophthora? Well, it's a huge tick for those wet conditions. So you also have the next one. You're going to have a greater reduction in soil oxygen levels if you've got those waterlogged soils. I haven't given a tick for the temperate temperatures. We're not really going to see that significant increase. And somebody else earlier on today had said about that. We're not going to see those really, really high temperatures here. It's still going to be in the ideal range, but there will be shifts. So there'll be some Phytophthora that we have here that are going to have conditions that are more suitable as in temperature-wise, and there's other ones where maybe it will get too hot and it won't be as good, or we might see shifts. Then definitely the environmental conditions that cause plant stress, an absolute yes for that. So now I'm just going to talk about sort of three groups of Phytophthora, and that is the ones that are established that are exotic here, the native Phytophthora that we have here, and then finally the border introductions and what this climate change means for those three groups. So for the exotic ones that we have here, as I was mentioning, with a hotter temperature, it is going to be less favourable for some and more favourable for others. Basically, you'll have some areas which potentially you don't get a lot of Phytophthora in that will open up and they'll become more conducive or the environment will be more conducive. So kind of I would say it's a shift across the country, a shift in regions. Whether that's going to be worse or how that's going to look, it's kind of hard to say. It's probably just going to be shifts in dynamics and the profiles that we see. The more severe storms is something that really, really worries me. We've got those really wet conditions, and part of it isn't just that soil is wet and it's more conducive for the Phytophthora to live, survive and cause disease, but it's also that change in water movement. And so I put a picture up of Napier, and you can see where on the top one, you can see all the rivers, and you'll have all the watersheds that would come down from that. And then you have a huge flooding event like we did, and you can see what's covered there. So all of those watersheds go out of the window, and all of a sudden you have the ability for a Phytophthora that's present in one area to move more quickly to a different area, which otherwise might have taken years and years and years for it to have moved. When it does move, it's not that it's going to be like, whoosh, you've got a big lot of disease. Sometimes it can take ages and ages for the disease to build up. So it could be 5 years from the point that that Phytophthora has moved. If it finds a host that is susceptible, it could be 5 years for that pathogen to build up and cause that disease that we can actually notice. So it's not necessarily an instant thing, and I suppose that's actually a lot with pathology. Sometimes you do like the ceratocystis, they are usually pretty instant. It's clear cut. Most of the other time it's more of a slower process, and then by the time you actually see it, you've got a pretty well established disease. The new hosts, that's something that I'd be expecting to see as you get Phytophoras, encountering hosts that they haven't encountered before and finding a new susceptible host, and higher disease severity, those waterlogged soils. And if you can get in quick and reduce the waterlogging and increase the aeration, really good chance that they won't establish. But then that's also part of it. Sometimes you might have a problem which starts off as a waterlogged soil, but if you get those inoculum levels high enough in there, you could actually end up with a Phytophthora problem, even though the original one wasn't actually a Phytophthora. And then the increased drought. Certainly when there's a drought, there's going to be an absolute decrease in Phytophthora. They don't like it dry. But when that drought goes, and got those ultra-stressed plants from the drought, that's what Phytophthora love. And so if you've got a drought followed by a flooding event, it's a good combination for the Phytophthora, but not good for the plants. So onto the native ones. In short, we know very little about our native Phytophthora. There's just a small handful that have been described that we know about. And that's not particularly surprising because this is actually for all pathogens. When pathogens, they're kind of not pathogens in their native range. When they're in their native range, it's a balanced ecosystem. There's everything that's sort of designed to manage it, and it's all nice. And so often you can figure out where a pathogen has come from because it doesn't cause disease on those hosts. Phytophthora canovia is an example of one that we know that is a native pathogen that causes disease. Custard apples or cherry moya, when it first encountered that, you just wouldn't want to grow that here in New Zealand. Radiata pine, and actually that's an example where we've had it here for a long time, but sometimes it can be quite hard to figure out what the disease is or what the pathogen is causing a disease, and certainly for radiata pine, that's an example. So we do know we have them, and we do know that some of those native Phytophoras can switch hosts to an exotic one. So what might happen in climate change? Well, if the conditions are more favourable, or if they change to suit those pathogens, we might see a shift in those disease profiles. We might start to see Phytophthora occurring on hosts that we wouldn't usually have expected them to see them on, or to what was I going to say there? More on new hosts, or otherwise just that inoculum, if it can build up, if those conditions are really conducive for it, it might start to build up, and then you start to see a greater level of disease. And that's canovii on pine needles. So with water introductions, just in general for Phytophthora internationally, over about the last 15 years, we've seen a huge increase in the number of pathogens that have been described. And sometimes that's not really that surprising because you've got new molecular techniques, you've got people out there looking, so finding more species isn't that surprising. But what is really concerning is that we've also seen a rise in the number of new diseases or changes in the behaviours, which is what is that concern with that climate change, are those changes in behaviour. Phytophthora also can hybridise quite easily, so they're quite a different group of organisms, and that's also a risk profile that you have sitting there as well. Increased globalisation has opened up the world for Phytophoras as well. So you've got areas of the world which previously people hadn't been into a lot, finding these Phytophoras and then transporting them to a new area, and then they find a new exotic host which is susceptible, and you've got all these new diseases coming up. So, under climate change, what would we expect to see? Well, what we expect to happen in New Zealand, we'll expect to happen across the world. So if you've got more rainfall events, you're going to have higher disease levels of the Phytophthora. So then you're going from a place where you have perhaps currently a low level of Phytophthora, all of a sudden you've got really high inoculum loads. So then your risk of that Phytophthora being transported becomes even higher. And, just sort of all of these dynamics. You're also going to have different plants that we grow in New Zealand. So we might have new pathways that get opened up here that previously weren't here. And if you get that Phytophthora in, not all of them, they're a bit variable, and some of them have very few hosts that are susceptible. Other ones have a really, really broad host range. So it can vary quite a bit. But basically, it's that same story. It's going to be new profiles, new shifts as we go into the changing climate, and I'd expect to see new pathways or potentially new Phytophthoras being brought into New Zealand, or could be brought into New Zealand, but our biosecurity borders are really good, so let's hope nothing comes through. So just my final one, because it's like the doom and gloom, and it's not the best way to end it, and that is part of it, is that there are things that you can do, and for me it's around that management, and that's really, really key. So the first thing is the baseline information, and that's absolutely essential, and I'm going to give a huge thumbs up to KVH, because I know that they've already gone out and done this work, and it is so valuable for an incursion response. And also, if we have changes in New Zealand, if you know what you have now, if something comes up at a later stage, you've got that knowledge. Did I have it here before? No. Well, we're dealing with something that we didn't have. Was it here before? Yes. Then you can work from that and figure out what's going on. So huge thumbs up on that one. Monitoring for changes is really, really important. Looking for those differences. As I said, it's not necessarily like a ceratocystis when one moment you've got a tree that's alive and the next minute, maybe 2 days or 2 weeks later, it's completely dead. You've got to be looking for some of these symptoms and checking it. So just keeping on top of it is really important as well. And then the final one, which is the same as human health, is flattening the curve. If you're looking to manage Phytophthora, you're not looking to eradicate them. You just need to keep that inoculum level down to the point that it's not spreading and it's not causing disease. So so that's my final ones, and I think a fantastic job to date by KVH on what they're doing in this Phytophthora area, and keep it up. Thank you.